So I think it's time for our first panelists to come up. And thank you. Can we come on up, Jason, Bruce? No, come on up, and I'll introduce you when we get a. Oh, there he is. So this first panel we're calling the quest for geoengineering, I think, or something of that order. And I think we'd like to focus on the sort of here and now, what's going on right now. The geoengineering is a very speculative field. It's a lot of talk about potential scenarios and things. And I really want to focus this discussion on sort of what is happening at this moment. And then in the next panel, we'll go into some of the consequences and sort of spin some of these scenarios out a little farther. And so we have a great panel for this. We'll have questions at the end. If you feel very compelled to interrupt anytime, that's great also, but we'll also save 20 minutes or something at the end for questions. And we'll ask each of the panelists here to speak for a few minutes. But let me just go through and introduce them really quickly. This is Jason Blackstock, who's a fellow at the Center for International Governance, Innovation, and visiting research scholar at the Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. And he has a background in physics, which is interesting. He's also spent some time in Europe recently, so he has a sort of international perspective on this. We have Bruce Rittman, who's the director of the Center for Environmental Biotechnology at Arizona State University's Biodesign Institute. Thought a lot about biotech and biosystems and how those play into this geoengineering debate, something that is not brought up a lot in some of the more conventional discussions about this. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And at the end is Brad Allenby, who is a professor of engineering and ethics at Arizona State University, the founding chair of the Consortium on Emerging Technologies, Military Operations, and National Security, and I know has been thinking about this for a very long time. In fact, one of the first essays, Brad, didn't you and David have a back and forth like 20 years ago, arguing about the world of artifice, that I found was very, so these two have been at odds for a while, which is very interesting. So did you?
Several times.
Yeah. Good. So Brad's obviously been thinking about this sort of larger philosophical implications of a lot of this for a long time. So it's a great panel, and let's just move on. So each of you just can speak briefly. Jason, why don't you start first, and we'll just go down the line.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. So Jeff outlined it as focusing on the here and now, but I'm actually going to go just a little bit into the future, thinking about what we might actually use SRM for. So I'm going to talk exclusively about SRM, about the category of geoengineering that's high leverage, fast impact now, as opposed to the sort of slow long term, because the governance challenges, as David alluded to, are much different. But where we're at right now with things like the congressional hearings and the UK parliamentary hearings is asking questions about how do we govern it. But one of the most important questions that I want to emphasize that has to come as part of that is, what problem are we trying to solve with SRM? Because the type of governance that you need and the type of even research that you need into the technology will depend a lot on what you're trying to solve. And I'll go quickly through 4 scenarios: global catastrophe, rational management, coalition of the willing, and political instability. 4 very different types of scenarios that could lead a small group of we or a large group of we to turn around and say, I want to use that technology. And by developing these technologies and having the conversation, we're opening it up to any number of these scenarios. And they have different research and different governance implications. So the global catastrophe is sort of the most obvious one, the Plan B. Representative Gordon mentioned that we could end up with a tipping point in the climate system. And at that point in time, we may want to use geoengineering in order to respond, SRM in particular, in order to respond because it's fast acting. This could be rapid melting of the Greenland or Antarctic ice sheets. It could be permafrost outgassing from the Arctic. Now, in these sorts of cases, The sort of research that you need is how do you respond to a global catastrophe? For some of these tipping points, like the Arctic ice and the permafrost, one can imagine using SRM to block some of the sunlight during the summer times in the Arctic or Antarctic, cooling it down and refreezing it. In other words, that's something you could respond to. People have probably heard of the ocean haline circulation shutting off. It's not clear that sticking aerosol particles in the atmosphere is going to do a damn thing for that. And if the Amazon starts to really go through catastrophic dieback, it's definitely not clear that cooling the planet down, even instantly, is going to prevent something that's already a potential runaway effect. So there's research to do on how would you respond to a global catastrophe. The governance challenge in this case doesn't seem to be that large, because if we're all terrified that the world's going to end because something bad's happening and we're going to have 2 meters of sea rise, we'll probably be able to come to a collective answer to stopping that problem. But that's, a low probability scenario of having a catastrophic tipping point. So something that other people have talked about in terms of rational management of something like stratospheric aerosols that you could deploy would be to relate it to the aerosol particles that we already put up into the troposphere. So Representative Gordon again mentioned the fact that China's building these coal-fired power plants, which every time you build, there's some nice studies that have come out recently showing that every time you build a coal-fired power plant, for the first 20 years of its life, it actually has a net cooling effect if you build it without sulfur scrubbers, which plants recently in the last decade in China were built with. As you put scrubbers in, it takes out the sulfur, and it leads to you're unmasking that sort of cooling effect that you get. But putting in the pollution controls to remove the sulfur dioxide has large local health benefits, large acid rain benefits, but it also has this warming impact. How do you manage both the local health implications and at the same time the global climatic implications? One of the best examples is the International Maritime Organization has passed a law to remove a lot of sulfur from seagoing diesel fuel. This will have a 0.4 watt per square meter impact on the climate system in terms of removing 0.4 watts per square meter of masking. That's the equivalent of more than a decade worth of CO2 in terms of the warming impact, which will be added over a small number of years, 3 to 5 years as they phase out sulfur. That in itself is almost a geoengineering experiment. One can rationally imagine saying, well, what if you just put that sulfur higher in the atmosphere so that you get rid of the local health pollutions? What if you built a management framework? Now, here the research it becomes a little more complicated. You're starting to do some attempts at risk analysis, some amounts of cost-benefit analysis, but you're also dealing with a very complicated governance structure. You're dealing with something like the UNFCCC, and we've seen how well that worked recently. So you're dealing with a complex negotiation of managing aerosols in that case. But that's a very different problem than the responding to global catastrophe. Coalition of the willing. This is in this sort of a scenario, one could paint something like the island states, the AOSIS group of island states, which are facing potentially an existential threat from climate change. Right now, in the UNFCCC negotiations in the fall, Tuvalu suspended negotiations 3 times in the first week because they wanted a 1.5 degree target, because otherwise they're going to sink. Well, from that perspective, if they're really facing an existential threat, one could conceivably imagine by 2015, they build a little red button and go to the negotiations to say, are you guys going to mitigate? Well, I now have a red button to inject sulfur aerosols. Are you going to mitigate now? It becomes now a negotiation tool, and you could imagine, because all the island states could group together, potentially with other developing countries, under a cloud of support from China or other countries, in order to create a credible negotiation tactic that splits the world into different categories of pro and con on these sorts of strategies. Now, that again requires an entirely different sort of governance arrangement to think through, because how do you deal a rogue actor, a single country who wants to go off and inject this? The world probably has a response to that sort of a scenario, certainly in small countries. Big countries like China, maybe not so much. What do we have in our political tool chest to convince China not to do this if they go into it? I'll come to that next. But in terms of the security and the international political challenges, coalitions of the willing, emerging into blocks of countries that want to use this technology versus don't, that's possibly one of the most challenging international political scenarios that this sort of technology can raise. And the research there is also more difficult in terms of the technologies, because your question then is not what do we want to do to solve this problem, but what could anybody else do to solve their problems? And in the list of technologies that David showed for SRM, stratospheric aerosols, cloud whitening, et cetera, there's multiple ways to do any one of them. And depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you could do any one of them. And you need to ask yourself, how quickly would you know if another country was doing it? How would you monitor the impacts? What could you expect from different variants of the technology? That's actually potentially a much bigger research program in terms of the types of scientific questions you need to ask. And the final one that I'll just raise as a scenario is the political instability scenario. The idea that, we've seen floods in Pakistan, fires in Russia, mudslides in China just this summer. Well, what if it wasn't Pakistan that was 30% underwater, but rather China that had been 30% underwater? If you ended up with a country of the size and scale of China having drought for several years, having massive monsoons and floods, one could imagine countries in that sort of scenario coming up with a political narrative, a political leader stepping forward and saying, give me 5 years and I'll fix what those Western imperialists have done to our climate. And this could be something where the technology that gets deployed and used isn't driven necessarily by a particular technical or climatic goal, but is driven by an ideological goal. We've seen countless technologies used in that way, but this is possibly the most difficult scenario to imagine how to deal with, particularly with large countries particularly if they have nuclear weapons. And we've seen these sorts of political narratives emerge numerous times in the past when countries are under severe economic strain. I mean, to take the extreme example, you go back to the 1930s and the narratives in Germany. It takes a series of catastrophes in terms of economic, environmental stability of a country to lead them down a path to look for a desperate solution that's quick, fast-acting, that they can promise to people, and it doesn't actually take a lot of science behind that or even a lot of rational proof to get a political narrative going. That's possibly the most scary scenario. Now, how would you govern that? How do you do research on that? I don't know the answer to that. But the reason I raise these sort of different scenarios, and we could think of a bunch more. I mean, these aren't exclusive scenarios, but they raise a spectrum of the sorts of things that we need to design research programs today. So when we're talking about $50 million to go into research in SRM, where do you want to focus that? What are the questions you most want to ask? What type of particles are you going to use? What size are they going to be? Where are you going to put them up? But where are you going to put them up, what size, and how will also depend on, are you planning to solve the Arctic crisis? Are you planning to minimize the global warming, the average global warming? What exactly are you trying to solve with the technology you're developing? And for the governance institutions, it's the same thing. You need to think about what scenarios are likely or plausible and then work backwards to what sort of governance you need. And they could look radically different to solve just these 4 different scenarios that I put. So how do you create a framework that handles all of that stuff in one?
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jason. Bruce?
I have a few PowerPoints. So.
Oh, sure.
Good morning. So I'm going to change the topic a little bit here, and we're going to talk about renewable energy. Now, to set the framework, I've taken from my IPCC report CO2 levels in the atmosphere at selected dates. And you can see here the pre-industrial revolution, about 280 parts per million, and it starts to go up with the industrial revolution. Kind of a pause while we had a lot of wars. And then after World War II, you see it's really going up, starting in 1950 and up, and it's up and up and up. And if you look down at the bottom here, you have some pretty high levels, and the IPCC really prays that, if we make wise decisions as human society, we'll pause it or stabilize it in this 450 to 550, but it could go a lot higher. Now you might ask yourself, gee, aren't we seeing effects already of this, bad effects on climate? Shouldn't we stop now? 390 is enough. How about? So if we were to stop now, and we would do it by reducing the output of fossil carbon into the atmosphere, we would need to return to the fossil fuel use of approximately 1950. A few of us in this room were alive in the 1950s. We know that the use of energy in the United States in the 1950s is really different than now. And then you start thinking about China and India and all the rest of the world, and it's quite clear that the services that the world gets from fossil fuel use are good services, and people aren't going to give this up without a calamity. So the goal isn't to go back and stop using energy. We're not going to stop using energy. What we have to do to solve the problem really is replace the energy services that we get now from fossil fuels with renewable, non-CO2 adding fuel. So how does that work? Well, it's all about scale. We've heard scale today. I'm going to talk about scale. So human activities now worldwide consume energy at somewhere between 13 and 14 terawatts. That's a rate. You can see the definition of terawatts in there. Roughly 84% of that comes from fossil fuels, and you can see the distribution up there. This is a lot of energy. This is a very large amount of energy that we are getting from fossil fuels. To go back to 1950 level of fossil fuel use, we would have to cut this rate, ballpark number, to about 1/3. 1/3 of what it is today, roughly. So that's a big cut. We don't want, and we're not going to tell everybody, stop using energy. So what's the goal? The goal is to replace fossil fuels with something that doesn't add a lot of extra carbon to the atmosphere and gives us the same kind of services that allows us to fly our airplanes, drive our cars, generate electricity, all those things. But it's at a huge scale. So we need to replace something like 7 terawatts of fossil fuel energy with something else that gives us similar value. And, well, you know, fossil fuels came from the sun. It was photosynthesis hundreds of millions of years ago. And now we're mining it. The sun's our only renewable source, so why don't we go back and just use the same principle as fossil fuel, but let's do it in a contemporaneous way. Don't mine hundreds of millions of years of fossil fuels, let's do it today. And this is using photosynthesis, and that's what I'm going to talk about here, using photosynthetic organisms to capture sunlight energy and CO2, producing renewable fuels that we can use to replace fossil fuels, solving the underlying problem that's causing the CO2 rise and everything else around. So I put a list here of the comparison of the two major types of photosynthetic organisms, plants, everybody's familiar with plants, and microorganisms, that's algae and cyanobacteria. And I have a list of 7 comparison points that are lined up. I'm only going to talk about 3 briefly, and those are the ones in color. So if you compare plants to photosynthetic microorganisms, the first thing is, well, where do they grow? Plants grow in arable soil, high-quality arable soil, the same soil that we use to grow our food. Microorganisms don't grow in soil. They grow in water. So we immediately, by using microorganisms, eliminate the competition for the food supply. Aerial production. It varies, of course, among type of plants and type of organisms, but in a rough scale, the productivity of biomass is the feedstock to produce fuel for microorganisms is roughly 100 times higher than plants. So this gives us the possibility of getting into the right scale, producing the right amount of high energy biomass to replace fossil fuels. And finally, the last one here is that plants are very water expensive. They evaporate and transpire a lot of water. We fertilize the plants. The fertilizer goes off into the runoff and pollutes the waterways. Microorganisms don't do this. We don't grow them out in the soil. We don't do this the same way. With a good design, we can make these very water efficient systems, very minimal water use. So we get away with the water problem too. So how does it look? So we're working on this. And we have actually quite a large research program on photosynthetic microorganisms at Arizona State. I'm going to show you a few pictures of what we're doing just to show you that it's real. I might go back. There it is. So it won't go back. Well, there it is. It went back. Okay. So we have a microorganism. In our group, we're using a photosynthetic bacterium. That's a very pretty picture of this photosynthetic bacterium. I want to point out in this one here, you can see all these lines in here. Those are internal membranes. Membranes are made of lipid. This is a very high lipid, high oil content organism. One way to use this organism is to harvest it and basically squeeze out the oil, replacement for petroleum. What is going on here? Of course, we run experiments in flasks, as shown on the left. We have very sophisticated benchtop laboratory scale photobioreactors where we run all kinds of experiments to understand these organisms, how to grow them, how to harvest them, how to make them happy so they'll do what we want to do. We have also on the right side here a large outdoor, what I call rooftop photobioreactor, because it's on the roof of one of our buildings at ASU. So this is real. It's going on. No, those are all green. Those are all the photosynthetic bacteria in there. So this is a real thing. Big research effort for us, and there are lots of other groups around the world getting in the act as well. So this is a real thing. Now the last thing I want to say here, and that's what we're focusing on a lot right now, is that we are getting these organisms, these ones here, to do something really great, a great trick, and that is to produce and excrete petroleum substitute feedstock. They pump it out, we harvest it and take it off to essentially a refinery. And this is a really exciting idea, because then we don't have to go to the hassle of actually harvesting the organisms and squeezing them out. It's not that easy to do. So this is a great revolutionary thing that we're working on. So it creates what I call a true photosynthetic factory of biofuel feedstock. So with that, I'm going to stop and just finally say one last thing. The idea here is to produce enough renewable energy, high quality energy, so that we can replace fossil fuels, solve the real problem of way too much fossil CO2 getting into the atmosphere. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Bruce. Brad?
Thank you. So I'm going to take off my engineering hat for just a second and put on my law school hat. One of the things they always tell you in law school, when you're approaching a new issue or a new case, understand who made your playing field and why, because that's going to have a lot to do with the kinds of degrees of flexibility you have and whether or not you're able to change the case to favor your position. I think it's important in this case because I would argue that for historical reasons, and good historical reasons, the geoengineering debate has evolved out of a playing field that is inappropriately defined and inappropriately narrow. Geoengineering comes out of the climate change discourse, of course. Everything you have heard this morning is about climate change. So geoengineering is positioned as a part of the climate change debate. The climate change debate positions climate change as a problem to be solved and not, say, a condition that needs to be managed over the very long term. Environmental values tend to be dominant, and it takes a very reductionist scientific paradigm. You isolate the problem, anthropogenic climate change. You fix the problem. You can do Kyoto, you can do geoengineering. It's a targeted fix for a targeted problem. The result is what you tend to get in the geoengineering discussions is the idea of single-purpose technologies to fix a single problem to be deployed at a large scale. That is dangerously, fallaciously simplistic. The problem is no technology which is capable of affecting the Earth's planet in a meaningful way can possibly be conceived of as a single-purpose technology. Anybody who knows anything about technology knows that that is simply misunderstanding technology at a very gross level. Technologies that powerful are not silver bullets. The railroad did not just put rails across the United States. It fundamentally changed what we are. The car did not just mean that you had 4 rubber things instead of 4 hooves. It fundamentally changed the way we think of ourselves. These technologies are not silver bullets. They are not single purpose. When we talk about unintended consequences, what we're talking about is a willful refusal to understand the complexity of the world that we've already built. And that's just unacceptable. So, what else? Well, so let's think about climate change to begin with. If climate change is a problem to be solved, then silver bullets are not necessarily inappropriate. If it is, however, a condition of life on a planet with 7 billion people trying for a better life, trying for energy, trying for economic growth, trying for opportunities for their children, if it is on a planet where we are already dramatically affecting not just climate change, that's the poster boy, but virtually all natural cycles and systems, then it's a very different kettle of fish. For example, we talk a lot about biofuels, corn-based ethanol being the most obvious example in the United States. What is corn-based ethanol? In some ways, corn-based ethanol is a way of fixing the carbon cycle by breaking the nitrogen cycle. Any biological system is not just carbon. If you accelerate the flow of carbon through a biological system, you also accelerate the flow of nitrogen, phosphorus, and all the micronutrients that go into a biological system. Why do we choose to break the nitrogen cycle to fix the carbon cycle? Because everybody's focused on the carbon cycle. It is a symptom of a single-minded focus on a problem where we have misdefined the problem. The playing field we have established is simply wrong. So, great, what would you do about that? I think we can redefine geoengineering to be far more effective. And I would begin by suggesting a couple of ideas. The first is continue research on geoengineering. It is possible we'll need the insurance. It is possible that in terms of risk-benefit, I think Keith's presentation here was very good, there are geoengineering technologies that we will want to call on. But before we call on them, we're going to want to know a lot more about them. The first thing we have to do is stop thinking of them as climate change technologies. They are profound changes to Earth systems, and they will affect major Earth systems across human-built and natural cycles. To ignore that is not to simply say there may be unintended consequences. To ignore that, knowing what we know now, is just irresponsible. So the first thing we need to do is we need to reconceptualize these and understand far better the implications of rolling them out across systems that aren't climate. So that's the first thing. The second thing we need to do is understand when these puppies go nonlinear. That's a very critical part of all of these technologies. Corn-based ethanol. Corn-based ethanol is not a bad technology. We've been using it in the Blue Ridge for a long time to produce various materials which have proven to be satisfactory to the public. But if you scale it up too quickly, too rapidly, to the level of our energy systems, then you begin to create major nonlinear effects, such as food riots, such as political instability, such as major shifts in the way agriculture is done around the world. These are not unintended consequences. These are easily foreseeable if you took the time to think about it at all. Second, we have to reconceptualize the idea of geoengineering from focusing on specific types of technologies to much broader portfolios of technology options. The reason you want to do that is because every one of these technologies, again, I think you pointed this out very well, have different costs and different benefits. We need to have as many options as possible in order to respond rationally to challenges that right now we cannot predict or foresee. What we do know is the future is going to be very, very uncertain. Because these are highly complex systems, it's unpredictable. The way you respond to that is not by throwing out a silver bullet and hoping to blazes it works without bringing everything down. The way you respond to that is by developing a lot of technologies which give you the opportunity to use the ones whose cost-benefit best fits the kind of situation you suddenly find yourself in. This requires a degree of sophistication in thinking about these technologies that we really haven't gotten to yet. For example, a geoengineering technology that I think holds a lot of promise is growing meat in factories from stem cells. We're advancing on that. Apparently they're making some pork sausages in Europe using this, but only at the experimental stage and only if you really like mushy pork. However, if you do that, if you can begin to significantly reduce the amount of land that livestock requires, livestock produces a lot of methane, it produces a lot of CO2, it's a heck of an inefficient way to make a steak. If you can grow it directly in a factory, you save land, you save sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus inputs, and it gives you more opportunity to use some of these other technologies. So what factory-based meat production gives you is flexibility that is synergistic with some of the things that we're talking about in terms of geoengineering, such as biological carbon sequestration. There are a lot of opportunities like this across the technology frontier. The use of information and communication technologies in lieu of unnecessary transportation is an obvious example. We don't look at these as geoengineering because we have chosen to define the problem in such constrained terms that the technologies that respond to it directly are viewed in constrained terms. We can't afford to do that because we need to have the flexibility to draw across the costs and benefits of these technology systems taken as a whole. We have to develop a more robust portfolio. So that would be my recommendation in terms of geoengineering. Continued research, these are important technologies, but we need to understand a lot more, particularly about scale. When do these systems go nonlinear? When do I put enough material into the stratosphere that I change the monsoon patterns? That kind of thing is absolutely critical. Secondly, we need to move away from this formulation of silver bullets and towards a much more sophisticated technology portfolio, which is not directly aimed at climate change. Climate change is part of a suite of issues that need to be dealt with. These issues are not going to decouple just because we don't think we're smart enough to understand the couplings. The world does not care that we think that climate change is a unique phenomenon, because out there in the real world it's not. It's coupled to all these other systems. And for us to ignore that, knowing what we know now, is increasingly irresponsible. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So as you can see, we have three quite diverse points of view about geoengineering here on this panel. I think that I would to focus this back to today, to what's happening right now in the world on geoengineering. I'd like to kind of connect with something that David left off with this idea of surprises. I want to ask each of you on the panel here today, September 27th, 2010. What geoengineering has many complications and many dimensions, which you've talked about: moral, ethical, technological, political. But what aspect of where we are right now, in brief, scares you the most? I mean, what aspect of this, of the way this debate is evolving right now, gives you the most concern? Jason?
It's hard to pick between the worst of all the fears, but the scariest thing in my mind about where we're at is the fact that we are proceeding down, and this isn't to take away, I believe research is necessary. Let me start by saying that. I support the idea that we need to be doing research, but just like what Brad just said, we're thinking very much about specific technologies that need to be developed, which have been conceived of by the minds of brilliant scientists that have a particular view of the problem that they are trying to address. And the research that will be pursued now and in the next 5 years is going to set us on a 100-year trajectory. Once certain technologies are there, there's a technological momentum to them that will take on a life of its own. And we haven't yet been asking any of the questions about what we're trying to solve and what exactly we want the outcome to be before we're getting into the phases of pushing the technologies forward. Or this conversation about what's trying to be solved is happening within a small group of scientists, and it just hasn't reached the public discussion yet. So all the people who will be impacted by this aren't yet having a say in it. That's the thing that I think concerns me the most, is that these technologies will have a life of their own before it gets to that global discussion.
All right, Bruce, do you agree with that idea that technology is driving this in ways that will have large implications that we don't quite grasp yet?
Well, everything it works that way. So, I mean, I think that the thing that scares me is that this idea of geoengineering, which is a valid set of tools in the toolbox, will be hijacked by people who have vested interests in not really wanting to address the real issues. And we're going to need a suite of things that we're going to have, of tools, technical and social tools. I'll talk about a few technical ones. Besides geoengineering and photosynthetic microorganisms, we got photovoltaics, we have wind energy, we have conservation. All of these things are going to be necessary. And so I'm very concerned that geoengineering is going to look like the silver bullet that Brad doesn't want it to look like. And the wrong people are going to grab it, and it's going to thwart a lot of other good things that need to be developed too.
Brad?
I think what scares me is a more general issue, which is the decoupling of institutional and governance mechanisms from the cycle time of technological evolution. It's happening in climate change, it's happening in human life extension, it's happening in a number of different areas. And I think what it means is we end up with very simple system solutions, very naive conceptualizations of very complex systems. And as you say, lock-in occurs. And what we're doing is we're locking in these simplistic assumptions in ways that, that are very destabilizing down the road. I think that we need to become far more adept at understanding and managing technology at the cutting edge than we are now. And I think this is just one example of that more general issue. And I wouldn't say it frightens me. I think it's a phenomenon we need to address.
Right, right. And it's sort of the story of Silicon Valley in a way, of technology, right? I mean, doing this. So I want to get, again, just to keep it on the here and now, I want to talk just a little bit about, get your thoughts about, Jason, you brought up this idea of the red button, right? If we're going to hit the red button. I mean, in the near term, from what you have a background in physics, you've been thinking about this for a lot. What does that red button look like right now? I mean, what do you see as the most likely kind of technology to be deployed here? I mean, give me some sense of handicapping these various ideas like aerosols and cloud brightening, especially the SRM stuff, which I know you're focused on.
Well, I mean, the real red button focus would be stratospheric aerosols. I mean, cloud whitening, while in principle it looks like a workable technology, the scale on which you can do it and what you need to build and knowing what impacts you're going to have isn't the same as having had Mount Pinatubo in 1991. Everyone uses this references with stratospheric aerosols. It injected 10 megatons of sulfur into the stratosphere. We got half a degree of warming the next year. It's something that people can point to. I'm talking, sorry, half a degree Celsius. I'm Canadian, so I speak in terms of centigrade. But it's the impact is something that we've seen from a natural experiment, and that's the most likely type of red button that if someone wanted to do something fast, they would press. Now, we don't know. We've got a little bit of modeling that has been done in the past decade, and it's definitely increasing. Europe has modeling programs going on now. There's been more modeling going on in the US here. There is starting to be some climate modeling expansively done on this, but that's about as far as it goes. We haven't done any real field experiments that tell us anything about our ability to understand what particle size distributions would be, where they would go throughout the stratosphere. There are some planned, and David Keith is among the leading thinkers on probably the leading thinker in the world on how you design these experiments, but they haven't been done yet. And so what we know is that Pinatubo cooled the planet, and one could, in principle, cool the planet by just getting stuff up there. But we don't know a lot more about that in terms of practically. We've thought about how to do it, but haven't done experiments on it, haven't built the technologies to do it yet.
Brad, do you think that our ignorance about how this actually will work and the lack of modeling and even small-scale experiments will in any way inhibit people from doing it? You know what I mean? In the sense that, we brought up China earlier, and and I want to talk a little bit more about that, and the cloud seeding operation there, and they have a quite enormous cloud seeding operation in China, many hundreds of airplanes and rockets and things, basically to no effect. I mean, cloud seeding doesn't work, but they do it anyway, simply because for political reasons, I think, and for a way of showing the people that the Communist Party is taking care of that the party is taking care of their problems. And there's a lot of reasons why we might do this, even if it doesn't work, or even if we know nothing about how it works. I mean, do you think ignorance will be any inhibition in the deployment of this stuff?
Well, I can't see that ignorance has ever held back the human race before. No, I don't think so. And And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that's part of the condition of life right now. I think you have to plan that people are going to be rolling out technologies, either intentionally or unintentionally, that have these effects, and that if I sort of took a meta-policy perspective, what that would drive me to is not trying to figure out how to play whack-a-mole with various people doing various things that are kind of weird. I think I would assume that they're going to do it, and I would try to, at the meta-policy level, build enough understanding and flexibility so that I'm still able to maintain the overall stability of the system in spite of them doing it, because I know they're going to do it. So I think we could address it, but I think we need to, again, go back and look at how we have defined the problem for ourselves, because what we've defined is a playing field where we can only do whack-a-mole. And I think that's probably what's dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Okay. On just follow up on one small thing with this idea of albedo management. One thing that David had in his slide, the reason I want to ask you about, you didn't talk about it in your presentation, but I know a lot of people have talked about the idea of genetically engineering plants in order to change the reflectivity of or crops to change the reflectivity of the leaves and things to change. Have you thought much about that? Is that something that's on your radar at all?
No, I don't know anything about it.
Okay. All right. That's simple enough. All right, so we're going to talk a lot this afternoon about governance, and we've been talking a lot about it already. We're here in Washington. That's an important issue. But it's really, especially when we're talking about technology, it's also really important to talk about the role of private industry. And that's something that doesn't get brought up a lot in geoengineering. It has been brought up. It was a big subject of contention in the fights in the last few years over iron fertilization in the oceans, because there was this sense of several companies were trying to, one company in fact actually did some small-scale experiments dumping iron in the ocean. There was a big outcry from environmental groups about this because it was seen not only as environmentally damaging, but as a kind of slippery slope towards involvement of private industry and building carbon credits, getting carbon credits for dumping iron in the ocean to stimulate plankton blooms, which suck up carbon, and essentially, making money off of this with a technology that was very questionable, when no one was very clear about how we were measuring the amount of carbon, if any, that was being, certainly some, but where it was going, what the real amount of it that was being sequestered and all of that. And there was a big outcry about that. And it brought up, and it still brings up, this question of private industry and what role that will have. Bruce, you talked about renewable energy, and obviously, I grew up in Silicon Valley. I know about the clean tech revolution is being driven by entrepreneurial energy. That's a big force in America. Entrepreneurs are working very hard in the clean energy field because a lot of them because they care about, of course, the welfare of our planet and civilization and all that, but also because they want to make a lot of money tearing down coal plants and replacing them with solar panels. And that's a good thing. But it's interesting to think about that dynamic within this geoengineering world and where private industry will play a role and how it will play a role. And I think that's really crucial in thinking about how this will move forward. So I'm interested in all of your views about that. Maybe, Bruce, you want to start?
I'll start. So you stated it very well about the clean energy industry. I won't restate that. Here's another angle on it, and it does connect to one of the pieces of geoengineering. So if you've got a combustion source, a power plant, a cement plant, a major CO2 source, now everybody is worried about the liability of the carbon emissions, but that's the wrong way to look at it. They're sitting on a metaphorical gold mine of value. A concentrated CO2 source in the right path is extremely valuable. It's valuable to me because I can grow my photosynthetic microorganisms much faster with higher yields, higher everything, if I've got concentrated CO2. So people who've got a CO2 source, concentrated CO2 source, whether that CO2 came from coal or petroleum or biomass or whatever, it's got a tremendous resource. So when they couple it with somebody who can grow photosynthetic microorganisms to make biofuels and other biomaterials. So this is a transformation. The last thing we want to do is take concentrated CO2 and bury it. This is really dumb. It's too valuable to bury. We need to use it to grow the analog of petroleum and coal and natural gas. Do it now so we have contemporaneous production of our fuels, and then we have carbon neutral things. So this is where I think a lot of the industries should get on board and realize they've got a resource and they should use it the right way.
So Jason, I want to refocus this a little bit. Thank you. You talked about solar radiation management. That's something that you're most concerned about, and something David brought up is the high leverage technology. So what about the role of private industry specifically in that?
Well, that's actually the point that I was going to raise. For CDR, we have existing market structures for managing carbon, the price of emission versus the price of taking it out. It's going to look roughly the same. With CDR, the idea of, with carbon dioxide removal, getting private industry involved will be fantastic for generating the sort of technological breakthroughs that we might need to be able to pull it out. SRM is an entirely different ball of wax. It's an entirely different problem, because now you're talking about something with significantly higher leverage over the climate system. I mean, David Keith showed that calculation that it's $0 per ton of CO2 to offset it effectively, $10 billion a year to offset a doubling of CO2 with stratospheric aerosol injection. This is a case where a market structure is not what you want, because, you know, if you start paying people to put sulfur in the stratosphere, we're going to make the last ice age look like a minor blip by comparison to what we can. I mean, it's just not a sensible mechanism for doing it. But if you take it from the private level even to the national level, who controls SRM technology? Who controls the path of development and the ability to inject particles into the stratosphere to control the average temperature of the planet? That actually has large political ramifications. And so you don't want private corporations have, I mean, one can imagine that Halliburton, let's just use an example, gets a suite of IP around technologies related to solar radiation management, and now they are a lobby group to encourage Congress to use SRM because they want their technologies bought and used. Is that a situation that we want to be in? Now, there are analogous situations in the past on technologies, the way we deal with nuclear technologies, for example, because we're worried about proliferation. We're worried about who controls it. It's not a direct analog, though. We have to think carefully about who controls the technology, and the big difference with SRM versus nuclear is extremely advanced science in order to be able to do it. SRM is extremely advanced science to understand what you're doing, but it's not extremely advanced science necessarily to actually do it, which is a different control situation. Injecting the particles is relatively easy by comparison to understanding what you're going to be, what that is actually going to do. So the role of the private actors in that raises a really big question as to whether you want them involved at all, or in what levels of transparency you need to have to ensure that the public interest, the global good, is looked after above individual actors.
So open source, you know, when we think about governance of this idea of open source kind of technology is an important piece of this. It doesn't get talked about a lot, right? I mean, do we want, you know, we're familiar with this idea of open source engineering and things from software and from Silicon Valley. Is that a good analogy?
Well, this sort of relates back to...
Do we want a Unix operating system in the sky, or do we want Steve Jobs' well-engineered, do we want the iPod in the sky?
So in terms of the technology development, I mean, the big difference here is, as I said before, we're at the stage of doing modeling right now. And in terms of modeling, absolutely, it would be great, you know, an open source approach to modeling what we're doing with SRM to get everybody thinking about different approaches and looking at how what the implications would be for climate and for food security and for other is great. But when it actually comes to doing experiments on the climate system, I'm not sure I want that being open source in the sense of anyone can go and poke something. Mm-hmm. There you actually want something that is, you want a lot of ideas engaged, but it's not clear to me that for SRM, open source, where different corporations are still developing technologies, and yes, they're sharing them all, but there's still going to be lobby groups for, I want to test my technology. Just take cloud whitening versus stratospheric aerosols. There's different groups that want to test what their technology would do. Well, if you start testing them both at the same time, on the global climate, we've got one planet to test this on. So you don't really get to run 5 experiments in parallel and see how it works out. You can do it in a model, you can't do it in reality. So open source works for some aspects of this, but I'm not sure it's the right analogy. You need something, some group, some body, some conversation globally about who gets to poke the climate system.
Well, this reminds me of one of the comments on one of the articles on Slate, which is geoengineering is a great idea, and we should practice on Mars and let everybody let everybody work it out there, and then we'll come back here and do it. But this brings up the question, though, of okay, you're right. You don't want everybody poking at the stratosphere and putting particles up or whitening clouds and doing this and that. But the question then becomes, well, how do you stop them, and what is the framework? Because this is back to that lone actor nuclear power or nuclear weapon paradigm of how do you keep the crazy person's finger off the trigger. But before we go farther down that road, and that's going to be a conversation I think a lot in the second half of the afternoon, Brad, I want to ask you about the role of money and technology because from this sort of especially with your ideas about how we need to rethink this, I mean, how do you see private enterprise and money driving this forward, especially on the solar radiation management part of it?
Well, so there's 2 fundamentally different ways of thinking about these systems. I mean, the way that we've talked about it all morning is that there is a way to govern this, and we just need to find it and establish it. Sort of Kyoto on steroids. Kyoto off steroids hasn't done too well. Kyoto on steroids, I think, has no chance. And I think the reason is that we need to accept that we're dealing with a complex system where the idea of a centralized, explicit control mechanism probably fails. You are going to have private industry doing all kinds of things that affect the climate. Again, we have to get out of this idea of thinking that geoengineering is all that matters to the climate. We think that because it's simple. It's wrong. For example, there is a lot of money in private industry right now going into radical life extension. Whether they succeed or not, it is clear from the data in the last 5 or 10 years that we're living longer in developed countries and that the possibility is that we may live a lot longer. That has huge implications for energy systems, for material systems, for geoengineering. Nobody in geoengineering thinks about that at all. Why? It's not part of the definition. I think that we need to understand we are in a regime where explicit control is not very probable because it's a complex system. Once you get there, it doesn't mean you give up hope. Once you get there, it means that you've got to move to a much more subtle way of managing these systems and understanding your limitations. And we're very, very poor at both of those. There is a huge amount of hubris built into the way we think about climate change. It's absolutely staggering to think that given what we know, we think we're going to be able to do what we purport to do. We can probably manage it, but only if we start getting off this idea that we think we know what we're doing.
So, Jason, I know you want to say something, but I want to say just one thing. This reminds me of a conversation I had with Marty Hofford, who's a well-known physicist at NYU who's been thinking about geoengineering for a long time. And last year at Aspen, we were stuck in the airport together for a couple of hours, and we were riffing about geoengineering. And he basically came to the idea that the only way we're going to do this intelligently is with like genetic engineering of our brains. That we need to the only way we're going to do this right. It's like forget regulation, policy, governance, all that. The human impulse is to fuck this up, and that the only way to do it right is to genetically engineer our brains. And Marty said this. He was not joking. I mean, this is the way Marty thinks, of course. But
one of the things that most people don't realize, unless they've been looking at emerging technologies, is in fact that the human is rapidly becoming a design space. Now, you look at any of this stuff, not in the next 10, 20 years, but I'll tell you that a number of kids in college these days are using cognitive enhancement pharmaceuticals that their parents have no idea are even around. And I think that it's interesting that in none of these discussions, which purport to go out for 100 or 150 years, do we consider at all the fact that we may be making fundamental changes in the human as well as the natural sides of these systems.
Right.
So I think there's a legitimate issue there.
Yeah, Jason.
Well, this goes to exactly the question because this is a political town. And I'm not sure that the role of private actors is going to be dominant, but I'm pretty sure that the role of politics is going to be dominant. And Brad, you're talking about creating an ontology, a way of looking at the world that's based on complex systems in an era where most political messages are boiled down to bumper stickers half the length of what David showed earlier, because you can't read them otherwise. And so where the political narratives are becoming more single issue, more narrowly focused, and yet we're talking about a technology that, particularly with SRM, that's going to impact 7 to 9 billion people, depending on when we deploy it in the next number of years, that is nominally moving towards a more democratic world all around. So no matter, I hate to phrase it quite this way, but so no matter how dumb you are, you still get a vote on this. How do you balance that politically? How do you balance the fact that these decisions are going to be made politically, not by the smartest group of people collectively, but by a political narrative on this, which is going to be issue specific? It's going to be New Orleans got hit with another Katrina and half of the seaboard was wiped out. God, we need to do something about this. Or it's China that's underwater rather than Pakistan, and those damn Westerners caused it. We're going to engineer the climate because they don't know what they're doing. I'm much more concerned that it boils down to single political narratives like that rather than any sort of a real framing of complexity. And I don't know how to balance those two. So that's my question to you.
Well, I don't know that the two are necessarily incompatible, right? I mean, I think that you're going to have political responses which are just as fragile as some of the technological responses. And to me, that simply is part of the way that you need to look at it. You know, if I'm doing local politics in the American South, I'm going to have different perspective than if I'm at DOE upper mid-level trying to honestly think about these problems in a deep way. So there are very different parts of the system that I think have the opportunity to change the way they look at it without making the assumption that you're going to change American politics. I mean, you're not. I think American politics becomes, in fact, a source of significant vulnerability precisely for the reasons that you give. So, for example, when the State Department worries about, what would happen if Al-Qaeda floated a bomb into a port, there's two things they worry about. One is the immediate response, but the second is what happens if America then goes rogue. So I think you have that kind of thinking that you need to do here. What happens if China gets flooded and goes rogue with a geoengineering technology? But to me, that's not part of the climate change or climate management discussion. That becomes a very serious issue on its own as part of the vulnerability of the human systems that we're living in right now.
Okay, so I want to interrupt this and take this down to nuts and bolts for a minute. We'll talk more about international stuff in the afternoon, but we keep saying if we do this, when we do this, if this happens. I want to focus again on this idea of solar radiation management, the specific thing of aerosols, which seems to me and to most people, I think, the most kind of clear and present thing to be concerned about and that is most, I would say, likely to be deployed in a way that, would raise alarms to a lot of people. But we've talked about if we do this, when we do this. Give me your sense, in the U.S., who is going to do this? Is this going to be something, tell me about the scenario about how this is going to be done. Is this going to be something that you would see, I know you're Canadian, Jason, but you've also spent a lot of time thinking about this from an international point of view and in the United States. Is this, how do you see this moving forward? We talked about research funding and things, but when it comes to actually doing the job, how is this going to happen?
That's the $64 trillion question.
That's why I asked.
I don't have a good ad. My speculation, if I had to place a bet now, I would give at least even odds that it won't be the U.S. and that it would more likely be an emerging economy, simply because of the alignment of politics and incentive structures. Within the U.S., you have a tremendously diverse political and long-existing political structure, and environmentalists and the chemtrails and a whole bunch of complexity, and you need a minimum of 60 votes in order to get some of this stuff even on the floor of the Senate. So the amount of political complexity around this, I think, makes it unlikely that the U.S. is going to be the first actor doing it. A place like China, a place like Brazil, like India, I think has a higher probability for two reasons. One, the political structures are just much more malleable to top down. We think this is a good idea, here's a narrative. But also because it can tie to narratives that already exist within those political arenas. So both the development pathways, we've been punished because them peoples over there polluted when they were developing, and they're trying to take away our right to go down the same path. This is a way to buy us some time. It's a buy some time argument, and they could realistically do that. It's also the we get to take control now. We're the emerging powers. We're the emerging future. We can do this, and there's more of us here to be affected. We're going to be more affected than anyone else, so we have a right. There's
so that's
just
an
more
interesting
political
spin on
narratives.
David's idea of leverage, right? I mean, the leverage applies to
Political leverage as
right,
well.
right,
Yeah.
right. Not just the physics of the climate. All right, so that's great. So I want to open this up to questions now because we have about 15 minutes left, and I'm sure you've had a lot of questions. Right here first.
My name is Martin Apfel from the Council of Scientific Society Presidents. Let's start with a set of principles that we can presumably agree a little bit upon. Principle that if we're going to even talk about going ahead with climate engineering of any kind, we better well understand all of the complex systems we're working with and how any perturbations of them will leave an effect. Our biggest risk is we don't know what we don't know. But let's look at some of the things we do know, where we might have a new thought, completely different than we've had before that has been discussed. What if, in fact, we decided that we would try population control and birth control as the effector for trying to accomplish what we want to accomplish? We know the system. We've already perturbed it and understand how it works. We understand the social consequences and the arguments pro and con and everything else. And we also know that if we prevented 2 billion people from being born over the next couple of generations, we'd have more impact than most of the things you're talking about. So why don't we talk about this?
So Brad, why don't you? I mean, you've voted for you've articulated a desire to expand the sort of definition of geoengineering. Is population control geoengineering? Is this something that we need to be?
Oh, no, I got stuck with this one. I think one of the things that question points out is the need, the benefits of a portfolio approach, which give you the ability to manage very different kinds of systems across different timescales. Population control, which, if it were done aggressively, raises a huge host of cultural and social issues. But it's obviously something that over time could have a significant impact on reducing the human perturbations of at least some of these systems, depending on a whole host of other assumptions, certus paribus. I think that one of the questions that raises is, suppose you've got that underway and you expect in 200 years to have a reduced population and suddenly something starts going wrong. You hit a tipping point you didn't expect. So what you need is, even with that kind of population control approach, I think you also need to think about what role geoengineering, what role some of these other technologies will have. So that, again, what you're developing is not necessarily an idea of a particular path, because those get to be very tricky in a world like this. They're good scenarios, but it's bad to rely on them as predictions. What you do is you develop the ability to respond in all time frames to the best of your capability at that point. And I think population control would be a part of that. So yeah, I would see it as a part of it, but I think it raises the other issues very much as well.
Okay. Gentleman here? Yeah.
My name is Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. I have a more fundamental question of the definition of geoengineering, and particularly the way you have spelt it on your documents that you do. It's a small GEO, or because that name was already taken many years ago by geological engineering, so it's kind of confusing. And I understand you mean by GEO, it should be capital G, capital E, capital O, what is global environmental observation or whatever it is, because United Nations has what is called the GEOSS, global. So I guess unless you put it in capital GEO, it's confusing. But I did hear congressmen talking about you, so somewhere down the line this has gotten accepted by some people. So could you explain that? How did this small GEO engineering came about? Because as an engineer myself, we always used it for geological engineering. And right. That's one aspect of the question. The second, I just want a quick comment on the population. I don't think the population should be part of this because we've been working on it for a long time, and it's been beaten to the death. And particularly in countries like Europe and United States, where the population is not increasing at any excessive rate, and we see already a xenophobia, which used to the import of population used to fulfill that little gap. It seems like, at least for Western countries, population management is not a solution, and I'm sure the others who have that problem will resist any kind of attempt to impose it.
Yeah. So thank you for the comment about the population. I'll just answer briefly about the question about geoengineering. At I think every conference and every conversation I've certainly ever had on this subject, there's at least a half an hour spent at that meeting debating about what word we should use to describe this. And, as the congressman said earlier, and I would agree, a more accurate term for this is climate engineering. Others have argued that it should be called climate intervention. Others have argued that it should be called climate restoration. And there's been, quite emotional debates about this back and forth. And I even wrestled with this in thinking about how to title my book. Well, I don't know about that particular, whether the capitalization, how that happened. But let me just say one thing is that as a writer and someone who deals with this stuff in public all the time, geoengineering is an old term that goes back to the nuclear age, to the idea of Earth moving with, changing rivers, the directions of rivers with nuclear bombs at Edward Teller and all that kind of thing. But once a phrase kind of gets taken up, it becomes this sort of it's very hard to change that, and geoengineering has become the sort of term of art, for better or for worse, to describe this. And it may be that as this debate evolves and we get more sophisticated in our understanding and thinking about this, everyone will start referring to it as climate engineering, or some other phrase will come up. But for right now, I think geoengineering is still this sort of term of art. David, did you want to add something to that?
It's a purely technical point. For what it's worth, it was first used in 1977 in this frame, so it's quite old. You're right, geotechnical engineering obviously predates it, and as you said, people endlessly want to redefine it, but it's not something that was coined in the last year.
Yes, here.
Hi, Alicia Coley from Oceana, and I think this question of what are we trying to solve is a really important one, and I feel like ocean acidification is often left out of this discussion, and I'm wondering how we put ocean acidification into this discussion, especially when it comes to SRM.
Jason, you want to? I mean, I think you should.
The short answer is with SRM, you don't. I mean, if you just as Brad said, if you deal with it as a one-off silver bullet, well, you miss some things that just don't get covered. If you continue on a trajectory of emitting CO2 and trying to counteract it with SO2, the oceans are going to be in an utterly dire state relatively quickly. So that's just when it comes to what we term this, we're not really talking about just geoengineering or climate engineering. We're talking about Earth system management. It really is a holistic framework to take that into account. Now, there are other things that David showed on the other side, the CDR, that if you're actually developing a suite of technologies to address the various things we've screwed up successfully in the past 50 years, then one would imagine, just like a doctor is going to give you a treatment based on your symptoms, you want to develop a suite of technologies or responses with social change and behavioral change. But SRM just will not address ocean acidification, period. Well, I'm not sure, because it addresses a different thing. It's, again, what you're trying to solve. If you start dealing with ocean acidification by, for example, liming the oceans effectively, then you're not going to address anything. I mean, that's it's sort of a catch-all idea, but it's not going to address at all what happens if Greenland collapses, if Antarctica collapses. So you can do anything you want to the ocean's acid at that point in time, and you can fertilize the ocean to take CO2 out. But if the ice sheets are already past the stage, and we're just not understanding the dynamics well enough, that's an entirely different problem. In which case, they may say, don't worry about ocean acidification, worry about something. So it's not a cut and dry, take this off the table, replace it with that because of this. It's taking a holistic view of all of the different problems and challenges, not only now, but 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and having a framework for managing this problem. And we're nowhere close to that.
And it goes back to the question that David mentioned briefly in the slide, which is at the heart of this geoengineering debate, which is risk management. How do you manage these risks of we know that we're running huge risks of pushing our climate around by dumping all this CO2 into the atmosphere every year. How can using solar radiation management or any of these other technologies reduce the risk of kind of catastrophic changes? And obviously ocean acidification is the big poster child for the risks involved with solar radiation, and not thinking about it holistically and actually solving the problem, which is too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Joel?
Hi, Joel Garrow, ASU in New America. Can I get some quantification from you guys? Jason, how many howitzers pointing straight up do we need to accomplish your red button thing? Bruce, how much land do you need for your geoengineered creatures to back out all the petroleum use on Earth? Brad, how many leaders will we have to see die before we see wisdom brought to innovation?
You go first on that one.
I want to hear that one.
So my answer is easy. If by wisdom you mean a conscious knowledge of what we're doing, I don't think the species is ever going to get there. If by wisdom you mean that we create enough tools to muddle through as we have so far, I'm not unoptimistic. There's a lot of adaptation going on throughout the system that we don't realize, which is innovation directed at very different things by different people that taken together represents emergent behavior that's quite fascinating.
Okay. To
Bruce,
me?
how much land?
Okay, so yeah, it's actually fairly easy to make the calculation to get this on it. So we know how much biomass we can produce at a reasonable but not outrageous rate. We know the energy content of the biomass, and you know how much energy we need to replace, say 7 terawatts of fossil fuel. You do the calculation, start with 7 terawatts, work your way back, you calculate the area. I did this. It's a very simple calculation, and I said, I wonder what that corresponds to. And I went to the atlas. And I looked around for geographical, political areas that matched, and it was Texas. Worldwide fossil fuel use, Texas.
Seems like a good.
All right, how many?
An ironically good choice.
Jason, all right, how many howitzers?
How many?
Or airplanes, or however you want to quantify it.
Yeah, so, I mean, the origin of this question it comes from the idea that people looked at and said, how are you going to get sulfur up in the stratosphere if you wanted to do it, if you wanted to do an artificial volcano? And you take a howitzer and you point it straight up and you fire a shell, and that sucker will go to somewhere between 35 and 45 kilometers, so well up into the stratosphere. So it's a simple lofting mechanism to simply get stuff up there. And if you just do the back of the envelope calculation of, what a shell could carry in terms of mass and what it would take to get it up there. If you had, we did this as part of the Novum study a couple of summers ago. It's on the order of 10 howitzers firing a shell a minute year round. And that's within their firing capacity. Now, of course, this doesn't take into account the challenges of getting, once you get it up there, we know that sucker's going to come back down if you don't disperse the material somehow. If you don't, so it's more complicated than that. It's much more complicated than that. But it's still simple by comparison to nuclear. And the whole point of doing that sort of a calculation was to simply show that the basic idea of getting it up there isn't crazy. There's lots of ways we could do it. Airplanes, high-altitude flights, the Virgin Galactic flights, I think, could get this sort of mass up there. And it's simply emphasizing that it's roughly existing technologies today, howitzers from World War II, could be leveraged and used in innovative ways to do the deployment of aerosols. That's the basic message underlying this. So the number of howitzers doesn't matter as much as the fact that there's ways to do it now. And this isn't just the U.S. and China. This is probably 50 countries, 60 countries around the world that could have that basic technology to build from.
So that would make a lot of noise, wouldn't it?
Depends where you put it. Texas, again, you've got at least that going off.
All right. I'm going to get in trouble for this, but one more. We can have one more question. Yeah.
I'm Mike Specian, Johns Hopkins University. I'm also representing a group of science policy fellows at the National Academies who are watching the webcast, so I hope if you don't mind if I ask two questions, one that's come in remotely. I want to follow up on what you just said. You said 10 howitzers firing once a minute for year-round. Do you have any idea of how long it would take to bring that online if certain nations wanted to do it right now? And maybe there would be a difference between whether the Maldives did it versus the United States.
The short answer is I don't have a solid answer for it would take 2 months or a year or 2 years. But in order to...
Order of magnitude?
Order of magnitude, a year or 2 years is not unrealistic. Certainly for countries like China, developed countries and emerging countries, very quickly if they wanted to. For a country like the Maldives, I'm afraid I just don't know what their GDP is and what planes they have, but it ain't that big. So, AOSIS combined, maybe a couple more years. But it's existing technologies, so it's not not 10 years. It's a lot less. It's order of magnitude 1 to 2 to 3.
Okay.
And second one?
Yeah, the second question is for Brad. Why have people, geoengineers and policymakers, not seen genetic engineering as likely to have such a sweeping impact as the one that you described? And what would you suggest or what would you do to change that mindset?
You have to be brief here.
As to the first, I think the simple reason is that we, because of the complexity of the world, we reduce problems and address them that way. What that does is cut us off from other areas where advances may have significant implications for what we're working on, but we just don't see it. We don't perceive a lot of the world we've already created because we don't have the institutional capability to do so. The second part of that answer, since I have to be brief, I'll have to talk it over with you in private because there's no bumper sticker that can get to those kinds of issues. I think it's something we need to work on.
Okay, so we have to wrap this up. But as a journalist, I'm interested in always fact-checking and things. And I can see that David is doing fierce calculations there in his notebook about the howitzer shots. Do we have anything that? Do you have anything? Do you want to say anything about because this is a very complex thing to try to just do off the top of your head, and I know that you've been thinking about these numbers for a long time.
This illustrates how there's been so much talk about this, but very little real analysis. And that's partly because there hasn't been a real research program. So using philanthropic money we have, we just spent $100K giving it to a major piloted aircraft engineering firm saying, do a set of design trade studies, not saying that we want to do this now. I don't think we do. But, what would you do? Because it's important to know the answer to these questions. And they actually looked back at this National Academy study that used the howitzers and found that it made a factor of 5 error. It assumed a completely incorrect number for the amount of mass in the howitzer, so it was just wrong. And they looked carefully at a bunch of aircraft design choices and hybrid airship design choices, and they found that either of those methods, using completely conventional design technologies for either one, can get materials to the complete operations and maintenance costs, can get materials to stratosphere for under $1 a kilo. And they did a really nice job because they looked at the actual operations cost of real aircraft fleet, and if these are people who used the standard RAND costing model. We've now given this to the people at Boeing Phantom Works to check. So I'm reasonably confident it's a lot closer to a realistic answer than before.
Okay, but wait.
And so here's the punchline. So if it's $1 or less a kilo, and you need something like something like 1 million tons a year or a few million tons a year, then we're talking a few $billion a year
to alter the Earth's climate as much as 2 times CO2. Of course, doing this will not counteract 2 times CO2. It won't fix ocean acidification and many other things. But that gives you the sense of what a tiny amount of money can have this enormous power to alter the climate.
Okay, just to clarify that with one thing, so that's the amount of money. How many airplane flights? So give us another metric.
Let's talk about something that looks a little bit like a biggest in class current bizjet. So a Bombardier, sort of one of these biggest in class bizjet. You're talking like 200 of them.
Flying how often?
Continuous operations from some bases. I mean, these guys have counted all the turnaround and maintenance and all their standard costs for the downtime and so on. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's not 2,000 and it's not 20. It's order 100 scale.
So basically 200 of these planes flying.
Round numbers. I mean, they have trade-offs between if you build larger planes, obviously you need a much smaller fleet, but then the design costs of the planes are bigger and you can't amortize the engine development. And, engineers like this kind of stuff. But the bottom line is we've several competent companies that were basically given the job, what would it cost to do this, assuming no major new innovation, have come up with sort of similar numbers, and those costs are very low. That's, again, not a claim we should do it, but it is a claim the leverage is very high.
Right, and obviously there's some headroom on that if we get better at doing it, the numbers could go down.
And what those things found is some other stuff that's been talked about. So the shells or these chimney ideas, neither of those appear to work very well in the real world, and aircraft or hybrid airships pretty much do.
Okay, great. Well, that will wrap this up. I think that was a really nice end to this with some real tangible vision of how this is going to work. So we're going to take a coffee break now, I think, for 15 minutes. Then we'll come back with the second panel, and we will talk more about the implications and governance and regulatory issues. So thank you all very much, and thank you to the panelists for all of this.